All right, welcome to week 6. This is one of those weeks where everything we've been building kind of clicks into place, or hopefully it does. Up to now, we've talked about ethics, what you should do, and then last week we layered in law, what you are required to do. Now we're bringing those together and asking a much more practical question. What does this actually look like in the lab? When you're tired, busy, and just trying to get through your workload. Because here's the reality. Nobody walks into the lab thinking, today I'm going to violate patient privacy, or today feels like a good day for negligence. That's not how it happens. It happens in small moments, quick decisions, assumptions, shortcuts. So today we're going to talk about 4 things that you will deal with constantly in practice. Standard of care, patient privacy, security, and professional responsibility, including social media, which we'll get to because that one tends to get people into a lot of trouble. Let's just ground ourselves for a second in where we are. Weeks 1 through 4, you were really focused on ethics, how to think through situations, how to weigh competing values, how to make decisions when there isn't a clear right or wrong answer. Then week 5, we shifted gears a bit and said, okay, now let's talk about law. Because in healthcare, it's not just about what you should do, it's also about what you are legally accountable for. And now, here we are in week 6. This is the transition point. This is where we stop talking about ethics and law as separate concepts and start applying them in real practice. This is where everything starts to connect. And honestly, this is where things start to feel a little bit more real, because these are the kinds of situations that don't just live in textbooks. They show up in labs every single day. So here's what we're focusing on today. Standard of care, privacy and confidentiality, data security, and professional behavior, especially in the context of social media. Now, I want to be really clear about something. These are not separate topics. They're taught separately because it makes them easier to understand. But in real life, they overlap constantly. Let me give you a quick example. Let's say you post a cool case on social media. That one action might involve a breach of confidentiality, a data security issue, a violation of professional conduct, and potentially falling below the standard of care, all at once. So as we go through this lecture, I don't want you thinking of these as separate boxes. Think of them as layers that stack on top of each other in real-world situations. Now let's bring this into your world, because this is where histotechnology really comes into play. Even if you never see the patient, and most of the time you won't, you are still deeply connected to patient care. You impact diagnosis, you handle protected information, and you absolutely carry legal responsibility. And I think sometimes there's this misconception in lab fields that, well, I'm not patient-facing, so the stakes are a little lower. No, they're just different. Because when something goes wrong in the lab, it often shows up downstream. Misdiagnosis, delayed treatment, or incorrect treatment. So this idea right here is huge. Behind the scenes does not mean low responsibility. It means your responsibility is embedded in the system in a way that patients may never see, but it still matters just as much. All right, this is the big idea I want you to carry with you through this entire lecture. Most problems in healthcare do not start as big problems. They start small. They start as shortcuts. They start as assumptions. And they start as those little moments where someone says, it'll probably be fine. And if you remember nothing else from today, remember this. Probably fine is not a professional standard. It's not a legal standard. And it's definitely not a safe standard. What POSGAR really emphasizes, and what we're going to keep coming back to, is that professional responsibility is about consistency. Doing the right thing the right way, even when it's inconvenient, even when no one is watching, and even when it slows you down. Because those small decisions, those are the ones that either protect the patient or create risk. All right, now we're getting into the first major concept for today, the standard of care. And this one is huge. If you take anything from week 5 and bring it into week 6, it's this idea right here. Because standard of care is what connects law, ethics, and your actual day-to-day work in the lab. This is the benchmark. This is what everything gets measured against. When something goes wrong in healthcare, whether it's a lawsuit, an internal investigation, or even just a quality issue, the question is almost always, did this meet the standard of care? So as we go through this section, I want you thinking very practically, not in abstract terms, but in terms of what do I actually do in the lab? And does it meet the expected standard? Because again, this isn't about being perfect. It's about being consistent, accountable, and aligned with what is expected of you as a professional. So let's define it in a way that actually sticks. Standard of care is the expected level of professional performance. That's it. It's not your personal best. It's not above and beyond. And it's definitely not optional. It's the baseline expectation for someone with your training, your role, and your responsibilities. And this is where POSGAR really emphasizes something important. This expectation is not random. It is built on your training, institutional policies, and established best practices. So when you're in the lab, you're not just doing things your way. You are operating within a system that has already defined what acceptable practice looks like. And the last bullet on the slide, not optional, that's not just for emphasis. That's reality. You don't get to opt out of standard of care because it's busy, inconvenient, or unclear. If you're performing the task, you are held to the standard. Now, let's break down where standard of care actually comes from, because this is where people sometimes get tripped up. First, institutional policies. Your lab has procedures for a reason. SOPs are not suggestions. They are part of the standard. Second, professional guidelines. These come from organizations, accrediting bodies, and best practice recommendations across the field. Third, training and competency. If you've been trained to do something a certain way, that becomes part of what you're expected to follow. And fourth, regulatory standards. Think CLIA, CAP, all of those lovely regulatory layers that make sure labs are functioning safely and consistently. So when you hear standard of care, I don't want you thinking of it as one single rule. It's actually a combination of all of these things working together to define what acceptable practice looks like. And if you step outside of that, that's where risk starts to show up. All right, let's direct the world. What does standard of care actually look like in a histotech lab? These examples might seem basic, but they are exactly where problems happen. Correct specimen identification. This is non-negotiable. If this step fails, everything downstream is compromised. Proper fixation and processing. If tissue isn't handled correctly at the beginning, you can't fix that later. That impacts diagnosis. Accurate labeling. Again, simple but critical. One mislabeled cassette or slide can completely change a patient's outcome. And complete documentation. If it wasn't documented from a legal standpoint, it didn't happen. So here's the takeaway. Standard of care is not just about big decisions. It lives in these routine, everyday tasks. And that's why it's so easy to underestimate, because it feels familiar. But familiar does not mean low risk. Now, this slide is one of my favorites because this is where we address the real-life thinking that gets people into trouble. Standard of care is not based on workload. I know. When you're slammed behind and everything is stacking up, it feels like the rules should flex a little. They don't. It's also not based on convenience. Faster is not better if it compromises accuracy or safety. And this is the big one, not based on how we usually do it. Because sometimes how we usually do it is actually not correct. It's just normalized. And POSCAR really pushes the idea deviation from standard of care often doesn't come from bad intent. It comes from bad habits, from shortcuts that slowly become routine. So when you hear yourself or someone else say, "We've always done it this way," that's your cue to pause and ask, is this actually the standard or just the habit? All right, so what actually happens when standard of care is not met? Because this is where things move from concept to very real consequences. First, errors. And in the lab, errors are rarely isolated. One mistake tends to ripple. A mislabeled cassette becomes a mislabeled slide, which becomes an incorrect diagnosis. Second, patient harm. And this is the part that's easy to forget. When you're in the middle of workflow, you may not see the patient, but your work directly affects their care. Delayed treatment, incorrect treatment, missed diagnosis. And third, legal consequences. This is where POSCAR comes in strong. When standard of care is not met, it opens the door to liability. And not just for the institution, but potentially for the individual. So again, this isn't about scaring you. It's about helping you recognize that those small decisions we talked about earlier, they have a direct line to real outcomes. Okay, quick review from Chapter 6, because this is where everything ties together. Negligence doesn't just mean a mistake happened. There are specific criteria that have to be met. First, duty exists. In your role, you have a professional responsibility. That's your duty. Second, duty is breached. This means you didn't meet the standard of care. Third, harm occurs. There has to be some kind of negative outcome. And fourth, this is the big one, the breach caused the harm. That cause and effect relationship is what makes it legally significant. So in the lab, it's not enough that something went wrong. The question becomes, did your actions or lack of action directly contribute to that outcome? And that's where standard of care becomes the measuring stick. Let's make this real. Mislabeling a specimen. Seems like a simple mistake, right? But let's walk it through using those negligence elements. Duty exists. You are responsible for accurate identification. Duty is breached. You mislabeled the specimen. Harm occurs. The patient receives the wrong diagnosis or treatment, and the breach caused the harm. That error directly led to the outcome. That's negligence. Same thing with releasing incorrect results or skipping verification steps. And I want to emphasize that last one, skipping steps, because that's where this usually happens. Not because someone didn't know what to do, but because they chose not to follow through. A small step can equal big consequences. And in histotechnology, that's everything, because once that tissue moves forward in the process, there is no undo button. Okay, real talk. No one plans to be negligent. No one shows up thinking, today feels like a good day to breach the standard of care. But people do rush, assume, and skip steps. And usually for reasons that feel justified in the moment. We're behind. I've done this 100 times. It looks fine. And this is exactly what Posecar is getting at. Negligence often isn't about lack of knowledge. It's about behavior. It's about decision making in the moment. And honestly, this is where professionalism shows up the most. Not when everything is going smoothly, but when it's not. When you're tired, when you're busy, when it would be real easy to cut a corner. That's when standard of care matters the most. So let's wrap this section up with something simple, but important. Patient of care equals consistency, not perfection. You are going to make mistakes at some point in your career. That's just reality. But the expectation is that you consistently follow established processes and standards. It's also not about speed. Fast is great until it compromises accuracy. And in the lab, accuracy will always win. So we come back to this word again, consistency. Doing things the right way every time, even when it's repetitive, even when it feels routine, and even when no one is watching. Because that consistency, that's what protects the patient. That's what protects you. And that's what defines you as a professional. Okay, new section, but very much the same theme. Responsibility. Now we're shifting from how you do your work to how you handle patient information while doing it. And I want to be really clear here. This is not just a nursing issue, not just a physician issue, not just a front desk issue. This is absolutely a lab issue. Because even though you might never interact with the patient directly, you are constantly interacting with their information, their diagnosis, their identifiers, their tissue, and that information is protected for a reason. So as we move through this section, I want you thinking about your actual workflow, not abstract scenarios, your bench, your slides, your LIS screen. Because privacy and confidentiality are not policies that live in a handbook. They live in your everyday actions. So let's start simple. What is patient privacy? At its core, it is the patient's right to control their personal health information. The key word there, right. This belongs to them, not to the hospital, not to the provider. and certainly not to the lab. The patient gets to decide who sees their information, how it is shared, and when it is used. Now, in reality, there are exceptions for treatment, payment, and operations. We'll get into that later. But the foundation is this. This is their information. And from a lab perspective, this matters because we often treat data like it's just part of the workflow. But behind every accession number, every cassette, every slide, to that information. And privacy is about respecting that, even when they're not standing in front of you. Now, let's pair that with confidentiality, because these two get used interchangeably, and they are not the same thing. Confidentiality is your responsibility to protect the information. So if privacy is the patient's right, confidentiality is your duty. And this is where professionalism shows up again. Because protecting patient information isn't something you do only when someone reminds you. It's something you build into your habits. Not discussing cases in public areas. Not leaving screens open. And not sharing information with people who don't need it. And here's the key. Access does not equal permission. Just because you can see something in the system does not mean you should be looking at it. That's where people get into trouble. So remember, privacy equals patient right. Confidentiality equals your job. All right, now let's talk about PHI, Protected Health Information. And this is where things get very real, very fast in the lab. PHI includes anything that can identify a patient and relates to their health. So yes, names, but also medical record numbers, diagnoses, dates, and even images linked to a patient. And I want to pause on that last one, because histology folks tend to forget this. Images are PHI. That beautiful H&E slide you're proud of, if it can be tied back to a patient, it's protected. So that means screenshots, saved images, teaching materials, all of that has to be handled carefully. And this is straight out of Poe's car. PHI isn't just obvious identifiers. It's anything that could reasonably be used to identify a patient. So the question you should always be asking is, could someone trace this back to a patient? If the answer is yes, it's PHI. Now let's bring it home to the lab, because this is where mistakes actually happen. PHI risks in the lab are everywhere. Specimen labels. Those tiny labels carry a ton of information. Names, medical record numbers, sometimes dates, requisition forms, paper or electronic. They often contain everything. LIS screens. This is a big one. Walking away from a workstation with patient data open. That's a breach waiting to happen. And then slides with identifiers. We handle these constantly, and it becomes easy to forget they're protected. But if a slide has a name or identifier on it, and it's left out or visible to the wrong person, well, that's a problem. And here's the thing. None of these are dramatic violations. They're everyday workflow moments, which means most privacy breaches don't happen because someone was trying to do something wrong. They happen because someone wasn't paying attention. And this is where awareness becomes part of your standard of care. Because protecting patient information, Well, that is just as important as processing the tissue correctly. All right, let's talk about where things actually go wrong. Because privacy violations usually don't come from some dramatic, intentional act. They come from normal, everyday behavior that people stop thinking about. Talking about cases in public areas, and I know you're thinking, well, we don't say names. It doesn't matter. All it takes is the right person overhearing the right detail. Leaving screens open. This one is huge. You walk away for just a second and your LIS is sitting there fully exposed. That's all it takes. Sharing too much information. Sometimes it's not malicious. It's just over-explaining. But if someone doesn't need the information, they shouldn't have it. And my personal favorite, no one will notice. Spoiler alert, someone eventually does. Or worse, it becomes part of a pattern. And here's the key takeaway. Most privacy mistakes feel small in the moment, but they are not small when you zoom out. Okay, this one? This is a classic. The no name showing myth. People think, if I don't say the full name, I'm fine. Nope. No, you're not. That is not how this works. Because PHI is not just about full names. Partial information plus context can absolutely identify someone. Think about it in lab terms. Hey, did you see that weird melanoma case from the 45-year-old teacher yesterday? You didn't say a name, but if someone knows who that is, you just identified them. Same thing with room numbers, dates, rare diagnoses, or unique circumstances. All of that can narrow it down fast. So the rule is not, don't say the full name. The rule is, could this information reasonably identify a patient? If yes, it's PHI. And that myth, it gets people in trouble all the time. Now, let's bring in one of the most important concepts from POSGAR, the minimum necessary rule. This is your guardrail. It means you only access, use, or share the minimum amount of information needed to do your job. Not everything available. Not everything you're curious about. Just what you need. And let's be honest, curiosity is real in the lab. You see an interesting case, you want to look it up, you want to dig into the chart, but if it's not part of your role in that case, that's not okay. Access is tied to responsibility, not interest. So in histotech terms, if you're embedding, cutting, staining, or verifying, you use the information needed to do that task. You do not go exploring. And that's where professionalism shows up again. Because no one is standing over your shoulder every second. This is about what you do when no one is watching. Now let's zoom out for a second. Why does all of this matter so much? First, patient trust. Patients are giving the healthcare system extremely personal information. And they're doing it because they trust it will be protected. Break that trust? That's hard to rebuild. Second, legal protection. These rules are not suggestions. They are tied to laws, regulations, and institutional policies. Violations can trigger investigations, fines, and lawsuits. And third, professional credibility. This one hits close to home. Your reputation in healthcare matters, and privacy violations, or even small ones, can follow you. So this isn't just about avoiding trouble. It's about being someone people trust to handle sensitive information responsibly. Because in this field, trust is everything. All right, let's talk consequences, because this is where it stops being theoretical. Institutional discipline. That can range from warnings to termination. And yes, it does happen. Loss of clinical placement. For students, it is a big one. You violate privacy at a clinical site, you may not get another chance. Legal action. Depending on the severity, this can escalate beyond the institution. So fines, lawsuits, investigations, it gets serious quickly. And then there's the one people don't think about enough: loss of trust. From patients, from coworkers, from supervisors. And once that's gone, that's hard to recover. So when we talk about privacy, confidentiality, and standard of care, this is what's at stake. Not just doing things right, but protecting patients, your career, and your credibility. All right, let's put you in a very real lab moment. You're working, you're in the system, and you're doing your job. But then, you recognize a patient name. Maybe it's a neighbor. Maybe it's a family friend. Or maybe it's someone you really want to know more about. And here comes the internal dialogue. I mean, I can just take a quick look. No. Not your case means not your access. And this is where professionalism gets tested. Because technically, you can click, but ethically and legally, you absolutely should not. In histotech terms, you only interact with what you need to do your job. Embedding, cutting, staining, verifying. That's it. You are not there to investigate people's medical histories. In this scenario, this is one of the most common real-world violations. Not because people are bad, but because curiosity wins if professionalism doesn't step in first. If you remember nothing else from that scenario, remember this. Just because you can access something does not mean you should. Access does not equal permission. Systems are designed for workflow efficiency, not curiosity control. So yes, you may have access to more information than you technically need, but your responsibility is to self-limit. That's the whole idea behind professionalism in healthcare. Because no system can replace judgment. And in the lab, you are constantly trusted with access. Patient names, diagnoses, histology images, clinical histories, all of it. So the question is never, can I? The question is, should I? And if the answer isn't clearly tied to your role, well, then it's simply a no. All right, now we shift gears a little. We've talked about privacy and confidentiality. Now we're talking about how we protect that information. Data security. Because it's one thing to know you shouldn't access or share information. It's another thing to actively prevent it from being exposed. And in today's healthcare environment, almost everything we do is digital. LIS systems, electronic medical records, digital pathology, and image sharing. So protecting patient information isn't just about behavior anymore. It's also about systems, habits, and safeguards. And here's the key idea moving forward. Security is not just an IT problem. It's a people problem, which means it's your problem too. So what exactly is data security? At its core, it's pretty simple. Protecting patient information from unauthorized access. That's it. But how that plays out in the lab, well, that's where things get real. Unauthorized access doesn't always mean some hacker in a dark room. Sometimes it's a screen left unlocked, a shared login, a printed report left on a bench, or a slide tray sitting out with identifiers visible. All of those are security risks. And in histotechnology, we deal with both digital information, which is LIS reports and images, but also physical information, which is slides, cassettes, and paperwork. So data security is about protecting both worlds, because if someone can see it, access it, or take it, then it's a risk. And this brings us to one of the most important points of this entire lecture. Data security is not just IT's job. It's yours. Yes, IT builds the systems. Yes, they set up passwords and firewalls. But they are not standing in the lab watching what happens at the embedding station, or the microtome, or the computer you just walked away from. You are part of the system. Every single day, your actions either protect patient information or expose it. And most of the time, it comes down to small habits. Logging out, covering identifiers, not sharing access, being aware of your surroundings. Nothing dramatic, but incredibly important. Because data security doesn't fail all at once. It fails one small decision at a time. Okay, let's talk about where things actually go wrong in the lab. Not dramatic cybersecurity breaches, not movie-level hacking, just everyday habits. Because most data security issues, well, they're not high-tech problems, they're human problems. Let's break these down. Shared logins. Seems convenient, right? Just use mine real quick. Yeah, until something goes wrong and now it looks like you did it. Unlocked computers. You step away for just a second. That's all it takes. In a busy lab, someone will walk by. Screenshots. Big one, especially with students. Taking a quick picture of something for studying or to show someone, if there's patient info on that screen, that's a violation. Personal devices. Phones, tablets, smartwatches, they are not secure medical systems. And once information leaves the lab environment, you've lost control of it. So again, none of these are complicated mistakes. They're small decisions. But small decisions are exactly how big problems start. All right, this one gets its own slide for a reason. Sharing login credentials. Let me say this clearly. This is one of the fastest ways to get yourself in serious, serious trouble. And I get it. People do it because it's faster. Hey, can you just log in for me? I forgot my password. Or I don't have access yet. And the answer should always be no. Because here's the problem. The system doesn't know who is actually sitting at the computer. It only knows whose name is logged in. So if something inappropriate happens, accessing the wrong chart, releasing incorrect information, viewing something you shouldn't, it comes back to you, not the person who borrowed your login. Fast does not mean safe. And in healthcare, safe always wins. Now let's talk about the part that makes everyone sit up a little straighter. Audit trails. Yes, the system is watching. Every modern LIS and EMR tracks who accessed data, when they accessed that data, and what they looked at. So if you're thinking, no one will know, oh, they will know. And not only can they see that you accessed a chart, they can see which parts of that chart you opened. So remember that earlier scenario, looking up a patient you recognize? Yeah, that shows up. This is how investigations happen. This is how violations are confirmed. And this is why "I was just curious" is not a defense. Because the system doesn't care about intent. It only records behavior. Let's walk through another very real situation. You're working. You're logged into the system. You step away, but just for a minute. No big deal, right? Except someone else uses your account. Maybe they check a result. Maybe they open the wrong chart. Or maybe they do something they absolutely shouldn't. And guess whose name is attached to that activity? Yours. Because again, the system doesn't track people. It tracks logins. So even if you didn't do it, you are still responsible. This is why logging out matters. This is why locking your screen matters. Because "I didn't do it" is not a strong defense when your credentials were used. Okay, so what do we actually do with all of this? Here are your non-negotiables. Log out. Every time you step away. Not "I'll be right back." Log out. Use secure passwords. Not your dog's name, not password 123, but something unique and strong. Do not share access, ever. Not with coworkers, not with friends, not with anyone. And lastly, be aware of your surroundings. Who can see your screen? Where are your slides? Is patient info visible? Because here's the bottom line. Data security is not about being perfect. It's about being intentional. And in histotechnology, you are handling patient identity at every stage. Specimens, cassettes, slides, reports. So protecting that information, that's part of doing your job correctly. Not extra, not optimal, just part of being a professional. And honestly, this section right here, well, this is where students usually go from, yeah, HIPAA, to, oh, wait, this actually applies to me? All right, before we move into the next section, I want to pause here for a second, because this is your big takeaway from data security. Data security is about habits, not just policies. Policies are written down. Habits are what you actually do every day. And in the lab, your habits show up in small ways. Do you log out every time? Do you double check what's on your screen? Do you stop yourself before clicking on something you're just curious about? Because here's the truth. No one is standing behind you all day watching your decisions. But your habits, they define whether you are practicing safely or not. And over time, those habits become your professional identity. So if you take one thing from this section, it's this. Good data security is not about knowing the rules. It's about consistently doing the right thing, even when it's inconvenient. Okay, now we're about to step into a space where a lot of healthcare professionals get themselves into trouble. Social media. And I know everyone immediately thinks I would never post information, patient information. Cool. I love that confidence. But that's not where most violations happen. They happen in the gray areas. Look at this crazy case I saw today. Not saying names, but Hey, guess what I found in the lab? And suddenly, you've said more than you think. So this section is not about scaring you. It's about helping you understand. Your responsibility does not stop when you leave the lab. Because your role as a healthcare professional, it follows you everywhere. So what is professional responsibility? At its core, it's this: doing what is expected of you as a healthcare professional, not just when it's easy, not just when someone is watching, but especially when no one is watching. Because in histotechnology, a lot of your work happens behind the scenes. You're not always in front of patients. You're not always being supervised. But that does not mean your responsibility is less. If anything, it's greater, because you are trusted to handle specimens correctly, protect patient identity, follow procedures, and make ethical decisions independently. So professionalism isn't about appearance. It's about consistency, who you are when no one is checking. Now here's where things get real for students. Professionalism does not stay in the lab. It follows you outside, into your communication, into your behavior, and into your online presence. Because once you enter healthcare, you are no longer just representing yourself. You are representing your profession. And in histotechnology, even though we're not always visible, we are still accountable. So let's break this down. Communication. How you talk about cases. How you talk about coworkers. And how you talk about your work. And behavior. How you act in professional settings. How you handle stress. And how you respond to mistakes. And lastly, online presence. What you post. What you share. And what you comment on. Because here's the thing. The internet does not forget, and neither do employees. Okay, here's the reality check. Healthcare plus social media equals risk. Not always, but absolutely enough that you need to be careful. Because social media creates a false sense of separation. People think, this is my personal account. This is just for friends. This isn't connected to my job. Except it is. If you are identifiable as a healthcare professional, and you are, then what you post can reflect on you and your institution. And here's where people get tripped up. They don't post names, but they post details. They don't show a chart, but they describe a situation. They don't think it's identifiable, but with enough context, it absolutely is, especially in smaller communities, especially with rare cases. So the rule here is simple. If it involves a patient, a case, or anything from the lab, it does not belong on social media. Full stop, period. Okay, let's start with probably the most common sentence people say right before they get in trouble. I didn't include a name, so it's fine. No, not always. And honestly, in many cases, not even close. Because HIPAA and patient privacy are not just about names. They're about identifiability. So let's say you post something like, crazy case today, 45-year-old male with a rare pancreatic tumor. No name, right? Feels safe. Except if someone in that patient circle sees it, family, friends, coworkers, that may be more than enough to identify them. And in histotechnology, we deal with some pretty specific and rare cancers or cases. So the combination of age, diagnosis, location, and timing can absolutely point to a real person. So that a mindset of no name equals no problem, well, that's how people end up in real trouble. Let's talk about why social media is actually more dangerous than people think. Because it's not just about what you intentionally share, it's about what gets shared without you realizing it. First, images contain background information. That quick photo you took, does it have a label in the corner, a monitor in the background, a slide with a case number? Because trust me, someone will zoom in. Second, metadata exists. Photos can contain timestamps, location data, device information, stuff you didn't even think about. And third, and this one gets people all the time, context reveals details. Even if you don't post identifiers, your story does. End of a long shift, wild autopsy case tonight. Now someone can connect where you work, when you worked, what happened, and suddenly that case isn't as anonymous as you thought. Yes, my personal favorite myth. My account is private, so I'm safe. Let's go ahead and gently but firmly shut that down. Private does not mean protected, because once something is posted, someone can screenshot it, someone can share it, someone can forward it, and now it's completely out of your control. You don't get to decide where it goes next. And in healthcare, that's a big problem, because even if your intentions were harmless, the impact is what matters. And I've seen this happen. Someone shares something in a small, trusted group. It gets screenshotted, it reaches the wrong person, and now it's a formal investigation. So if your safety plan is, well, it's private, that is not a safety plan. Now let's talk about what actually happens when things go wrong. Because this is not just a don't do that conversation. There are real consequences. Students have been removed from programs, denied clinical rotations, prevented from graduating, and employees, well, they've been terminated. Not warned, not retrained, but terminated. And depending on the situation, legal action is absolutely possible, because patient privacy violations are not just policy issues. They are legal issues. And here's the part people don't always think about. Even if you delete the post, the damage may already be done. Screenshots exist. Audit trails exist. Reports happen. So this isn't about fear, it's about awareness. Because one post can undo years of work. Let's bring this back to our world, histotechnology. Because people sometimes think, well, I'm not patient facing, so this doesn't apply to me. Oh, but it absolutely does. Let's look at some examples. Posting slides. Look at this beautiful H&E. Cool. Love the enthusiasm. But does it have a case number? Is it tied to a recent case? And could it be a traced block? Or I'm sorry, could it be traced back? Problem. Posting specimens. Check out this wild, gross specimen. Okay, first of all, maybe don't lead with wild. But also, is it identifiable? Is it rare? Is it tied to a known case? If so, that's a problem. Posting interesting cases. This is the big one. Not naming names, but today we saw, nope, stop right there. That's exactly how information gets pieced together. So here's the professional takeaway. If it came from the lab, it stays in the lab. And if you're ever unsure, don't post it, because I promise you, no one has ever gotten in trouble for something they didn't post. Let's make this really simple. If it involves a patient, a specimen, or a case, it does not belong online. Full stop. No exceptions. No, but what ifs. No, I only shared it with. No, it was just for educational purposes. Because here's the reality in histotechnology. We are constantly working with materials that are directly tied to real people. That block you're cutting, that slide you're staining, or that specimen you're grossing, that's someone's story. And our responsibility is to protect that story, not broadcast it. So when it feels interesting, even when it feels educational, and especially when it feels harmless, because the second it leaves the controlled environment of the lab, you lose control of it. So your boundary needs to be crystal clear. If it came from a patient, it stays off social media. Now, I'm not saying don't be curious, and I'm definitely not saying don't learn, because let's be honest, this field is fascinating. You're going to see things that make you go, wait, what is that? And that curiosity, that's what makes you good at this. But there's a better way to handle it. Keep learning offline. Talk to your instructors, your preceptors, your classmates in appropriate, protected environments, because those spaces are designed for learning and privacy. Second, discuss in appropriate settings, not TikTok, not Instagram, and not group chats that include people outside the field. And third, respect boundaries, not just institutional boundaries, but professional ones as well. Because professionalism isn't just about what you know, it's about how you handle what you know. If you take one thing from this entire section, let it be this. Intent does not erase impact. You can have the best intentions in the world. You can think, I was just sharing something cool, or I didn't mean any harm, or I didn't think anyone would see it. But in healthcare, impact is what matters, because the impact could be a privacy violation, a loss of patient trust, a damaged professional reputation, and once that happens, you don't get to undo it. So before you post anything, even something that feels small, ask yourself, what could this turn into if it leaves my control? If there's even a small risk, do not post it. All right, let's zoom out for a second. Everything we've talked about, data security, patient privacy, professional responsibility, social media, it's all connected. This is not separate topics. This is your standard of care. Because being a healthcare professional is not just about cutting perfect sections, staining beautiful slides, recognizing pathology. It's also about protecting the people behind the specimens. So when we talk about privacy, data security, and professional behavior, these aren't extra rules. These are part of doing your job correctly. And the key takeaway here is they all overlap. They don't get to separate. I'm good in the lab, but nope. It's all one professional identity. This is where it all comes together, because at the end of the day, you are not just learning skills, you are becoming a healthcare professional. And that comes with expectations that extend beyond the lab, the classroom, and the hospital. into everything you do, including online, because patients don't see you as, oh, they're only professional during lab hours. No, they see you as a professional, period. So your responsibility is consistent. Data protection, protect privacy, maintain security, demonstrate professionalism, even when no one is watching, even when it's inconvenient, even when it feels harmless, because this field is built on trust. And once that trust is broken, it's incredibly hard to get back. So if you remember nothing else from this entire lecture, remember this. You represent the profession at all times. Act accordingly. Okay, this is your mental checklist, because in the real world, no one is going to hand you a policy mid-decision. You're going to be in the moment. You're tired, you're busy, you're moving fast, and that's exactly when mistakes happen. So instead of relying on memory, you rely on questions. Ask yourself, is this appropriate? Is this necessary? Could this cause harm? And here's the key. If you hesitate on any of those answers, the hesitation is your answer. In histotechnology, we make hundreds of small decisions every day. Most feel real or routine, but some carry weight you don't immediately see. So build the habit now. Pause, think, then act. Because good professionals don't just know the rules, they know how to apply them in real time. Let's make this practical. You're in the lab and something feels off. Not necessarily wrong, but not clearly right either. And that's the space where a lot of people get into trouble. So what do? First, pause. Not everything requires an immediate reaction. Taking a second to think is not a weakness, it's professionalism. Second, ask. Ask your instructor. Ask your supervisor. Ask someone with experience. Because healthcare is not a figure it out quietly and hope for the best environment. And third, do not assume. Don't assume something is okay just because you've seen someone else do it, or it hasn't caused a problem yet, or it seems fine. Because seems fine is how problems start. Strong professionals ask questions. Weak decisions happen when we don't. If we strip everything down to one core idea, it's this: small decisions matter. It's not usually the big, obvious mistakes that get people into trouble, but it's the small ones, the quick ones, the this is probably fine ones, the ones no one thinks about twice. But here's the reality. Small decisions stack, and over time they shape your habits, your judgment, and your reputation. Because professionalism is not something you turn on during exams or evaluations. It's built in the small moments. So every time you choose to protect privacy, ask a question, or think before acting, you are reinforcing what kind of professional you're becoming. And let me leave you with this. Probably fine is not a professional standard. It's just not. Healthcare doesn't run on guessing, hoping, or assuming things will work out. It runs on intentional, informed, and responsible decisions. Because what we do matters. The slides you produce matter. The specimens you handle matter. And the information you protect matters. And most importantly, the people behind all of it matter. So as you move forward in this field, remember, you are not just learning how to do a job. You are learning how to carry responsibility. And the best professionals? Well, they don't aim for probably fine. They aim for consistently right. Thanks.